At the back of a cave, the forest seemed to hide on purpose. A wolf struggled to breathe, her body too heavy, her belly weighed down with the lives she carried, her heart pounding too fast to be mere exhaustion. A low whimper escaped into the darkness, not from hunger, not from ordinary fear, but from the kind of suffering carried alone, because there was no one nearby to share the weight. Far off in the distance, a voice was calling out a name across the whole forest. It was the voice of Alpha King Kelvorn, and it sounded desperate, as if the world itself might fall apart if that call went unanswered in time. She didn't answer. She only curled in a little tighter, shielding with her own body something only she knew the true weight of protecting. But it was the sound of that low cry that cut through the silence of the woods and reached the ears of a woman who also knew, all too well, what it meant to suffer alone. Valira came from the low-born line of Dorith, the worst sentence a family could hand a child, right after her own name. Her whole life, she'd learned never to lower her head, even when the entire town seemed eager to see her made smaller than she was. She fled to that empty forest whenever the humiliation grew too heavy, because there, among the trees, no one asked her last name before deciding what she was worth. She hadn't expected to find so much pain hidden in such a small place, hadn't expected to kneel in the dark, hand trembling as she reached out, with no way of knowing whether she'd be bitten or accepted, and had no idea that low whimper concealed a secret capable of changing the fate of an entire kingdom. Nor did she know that the voice calling out there, drawing closer, belonged to a king. But that morning, as her hand touched that dark fur for the first time, and she felt the tremor of a fear that wasn't only the wolf's own, Valira had no idea she was about to discover that the real danger had never been rejection. It was, finally, being deeply, completely chosen. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. The smell of wet earth always arrived before the sound of footsteps, and that's how Valira knew she was close. That stretch of forest nobody else wanted, which was exactly why it belonged to her and no one else. She made her way down the narrow trail, bare feet sinking into the cold dirt, and felt the weight of the day slide off her shoulders like an old shawl. Behind her sat the town, with its crooked houses and even more crooked stairs. Ahead, just trees, moss, and a silence that never judged her. Just a little further, she whispered to herself, the way she did every single day, as if she needed to convince herself she was allowed to breathe deep, even once. Valira came from the low-born line of Doreth, the worst news a family could deliver to a newborn right after announcing its name. She'd learned early that her voice counted for less at the town gatherings, that her place was in the back, always in the back, as if her body owed an apology just for taking up space. The other townsfolk, as poor as she was, but with the right last name, had a special talent for dressing up humiliation as good manners. Valira, my goodness, still wandering these parts? The shopkeeper, Safi, had said that morning, smiling sweet as spoiled milk. Careful now, the woods don't exactly roll out the welcome mat for just anybody. And the town does, Valira thought, swallowing the sharp comeback burning on her tongue. Not because she was scared. She never lowered her head, never gave anyone the satisfaction of seeing her shrink, but because she'd learned that wasting ammunition on small people was a bad trade. She saved her pride for the fights that actually mattered. That's when it happened, somewhere between one bitter thought and the next. She heard a sound. Not human. Low, rough, somewhere between a howl and a whimper, coming from somewhere below, like the forest itself had a stomachache. Valira stopped cold. Every ounce of toughness she'd spent a lifetime building drained right out of her, and what was left was just a woman, alone, listening to something in pain in the dark. "Hey!" she called out, soft, like someone trying not to spook whatever was crying, or herself. Anybody there?" The crying stopped. Then it came back, weaker, almost pleading. She followed the sound to the mouth of a cave she could have sworn she knew this forest well enough to have seen before, and never had. The opening was narrow, tangled with roots like interlocked fingers, hiding whatever was inside from the rest of the world. Valira hesitated exactly a second and a half. Then she went in, because hesitating longer than that had never really been her style. Inside, the darkness smelled like dirt, moonlight, and something older, a scent she couldn't quite name, but that somehow felt more dignified than any perfume she'd ever caught a whiff of back in town. And curled up in the back, shielding a nest of dry leaves and moss with her own body, was a wolf. Coat black as midnight, catching the faintest shimmer where the light from the entrance reached her, golden eyes locked on Valira with a mix of suspicion and pure exhaustion that she recognized instantly, because it was the same look she gave her own reflection on the bad days. "Easy," Valira murmured, hands open, showing she'd brought nothing but curiosity and a healthy dose of wanting to help. "I'm not going to hurt you." The wolf growled low, but didn't lunge. And it was only when Valira took one more step closer that she noticed it. The wolf's belly was huge, round, taut, ready to burst with life, but not quite yet. There was still time left. The creature looked worn out from guarding something that hadn't even been born yet, all on her own. "Ah." Valira sat down slowly on the stone floor, ignoring the cold damp seeping through her patched-up dress. "So that's it. You just wanted somewhere quiet, huh? Believe me, I get it." The wolf studied her for a long moment, like she was weighing whether this ragged stranger deserved any trust. Then slowly, so slowly, she rested her head on her front paws, eyes never leaving Valira's. Valira laughed, a low, surprised sound. "Okay, I'm taking that as a, you can stay, but don't even think about hugging me." They sat there a good while, woman and wolf, each worn down in her own way, each used to fending for herself. Valira couldn't quite explain why her chest went tight just looking at that animal, massive and fragile all at once. But maybe it was because, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she'd found someone else carrying a weight far from anybody's watching eyes. It was the sound of hooves and heavy paws outside that broke the moment. The wolf's head snapped up, ears pinned forward, and a low growl, not threatening, almost relieved, rumbled out of her. Valira scrambled to her feet, heart pounding out of rhythm, right as a massive shadow filled the cave entrance. The man, if man was even the right word for that, had to duck to fit through the opening, and even then his shoulders brushed the rock on both sides. His dark hair was tied back in a rush, like he'd sprinted out of somewhere without a second thought, and his eyes, burnt amber, landed first on the wolf, then, with an almost violent speed, on Valira. She recognized that look immediately. It was the same one stamped on the kingdom's coins, painted on the banners, worn by the frightened faces of the town elders every time they lowered their voices to say his name, like saying it too loud might summon trouble. The Alpha King, Kaelvorn Drast Ren. You. His voice was thunder barely held in check, and he took 2 quick steps toward her before apparently remembering that might spook both the wolf and the stranger crouched beside her. He stopped, breathed, tried again, in a tone slightly less end of the world. "Who are you, and what did you do to Nightshade?" "Nightshade?" Valira raised an eyebrow, still sitting on the ground, absolutely refusing to jump to her feet just because some bossy king had come barging into a cave that, technically, she'd found first. "That's an awfully fancy name for a lady all tangled up in dead leaves." Kaelvorn blinked. Clearly, he wasn't used to being talked back to like that, least of all by a barefoot woman with mud on her hem and not one visible ounce of fear in her eyes. "She's—" He hesitated, and for the first time his voice lost some of its thunder, going almost human, almost tired. "She's the most important thing my kingdom has, and she went missing this morning, and I've searched every inch of this godforsaken forest, and you're sitting here with her like it's a picnic." "Well, technically," Valira gestured at the wolf's enormous belly. "She didn't go missing for a stroll. She came here to hide. And with all due respect, Your Majesty, if I were her and had to put up with somebody yelling 'Nightshade' through the whole forest, I'd have run off to rest my ears too." For just a second, one quick, almost invisible second, something in Kaelvorn's face gave way. Not quite a smile, but the closest relative of one that stern face was probably willing to allow in public. He glanced at the wolf, who lay there calm as ever, like she approved of every single word out of the stranger's mouth, then looked back at Valira. "You're not afraid of me," he said, almost fascinated, like he'd just found a flower growing somewhere it had no business growing. "Should I be?" she shot back, finally standing, brushing the dirt off her worn dress with a dignity that dared every last thread of that fabric to argue. "Because as far as I can tell, all you're doing is yelling a wolf's name and looking at me like I just made off with the crown jewels." Kaelvorn opened his mouth, closed it, and more to his own surprise than hers, let out a short, rough laugh, like it had been sitting unused for far too long. "Nobody," he said, that laugh still lingering in his voice, "has ever talked to me like that." "Then maybe it's about time somebody started," Valira answered, with no idea, in that moment, that the words she'd just tossed off in a dark cave, beside a pregnant wolf guarding a secret only time would reveal, were the first thread of a fate the two of them hadn't chosen yet. But that was already, slowly, tying their names together. Outside, the wind shook the leaves, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Morning light never made it all the way down into the cave, so when Valira opened her eyes, she had no idea how long she'd slept sitting up against the cold stone wall, only that her neck ached and that a huge black head was resting, uninvited, on her lap. "Oh," she muttered, blinking down at Nightshade, who hadn't so much as twitched. "So we're doing this now." The wolf cracked one golden eye open, gave her the distinct impression of being judged, and went back to sleep. Across the cave, Kaelvorn hadn't slept at all. He sat with his back against the opposite wall, arms crossed, watching the two of them with the wary focus of a man who still wasn't sure whether the stranger from the woods was a threat, a nuisance, or, worse, someone he was already, against every ounce of good judgment, starting to like. "You snore," he said. "I do not." "You do, like a very small, very furious bear." "That's rich, coming from a man who spent the whole night staring at me like I might steal the royal silverware. I was making sure you didn't run off with my wolf." "Your wolf," Valira said, glancing down at Nightshade's very content, very heavy weight pinning her legs in place, "seems to have adopted me. I think the theft's already happened. You're welcome to file a complaint." Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, but a crack in the granite. He looked away first, out toward the gray light creeping through the cave mouth, and for a moment his jaw tightened in a way that had nothing to do with her at all. "She can't stay here," he said, quieter now. "It isn't safe. Not with her condition." "Then why hasn't she gone back with you?" He didn't answer right away. Valira watched something pass behind his amber eyes, tired, old, heavier than a king's crown had any right to be. "Because back at the keep," he finally said, "everyone treats her like a symbol, a blessing, a piece of the kingdom's luck wrapped in fur. Nobody just lets her be tired." He paused, and his voice dropped lower, almost like he hadn't meant to say the next part out loud. "I don't think anyone's asked her how she's doing in years, including me." Valira looked down at Nightshade, who let out a long, sleepy sigh against her leg and felt something twist in her chest. Recognition, unwelcome, and immediate. She knew exactly what it felt like to be a symbol instead of a person. To have your worth measured by what you represented to everyone else, and never by what you actually needed. Well, she said, clearing her throat before that feeling could get too comfortable. She picked a good hiding spot then. Nobody bothers me out here either. Occupational hazard of being lowborn. People tend to forget you exist, which, frankly, has its perks. Kaelvorn's eyes snapped to hers, sharper now. Lowborn? Valira of the lowborn line of Doreth, she said, with a small mocking bow she didn't bother standing up for. Try not to faint from the scandal of it, Your Majesty. I'm not going to faint. You looked like you might for a second there. I was recalculating, he said, with the wounded dignity of a man who absolutely had almost fainted. The line of Doreth doesn't come this deep into the woods. It's forbidden territory for people like me. Yes, I'm aware. I read the signs. I just don't happen to care what they say. She tilted her chin up, daring him to make something of it. This forest doesn't ask for my last name before letting me breathe in it. Funny how the trees have better manners than half your kingdom. For a long moment, Kaelvorn just looked at her. Really looked. The way people rarely did. Like he was recalculating something bigger than her lineage. You're very difficult, he said finally. You're very tall and shouting at wolves. We all have our crosses to bear. That earned her the wolf laugh again. That same rusty, out-of-practice sound, like his own amusement had caught him off guard. Nightshade's ears twitched at the noise, and she huffed against Valira's leg, which Valira chose to interpret as approval. They stayed in the cave through the better part of the morning, an unspoken truce settling between the three of them. Man, wolf, and low-born woman, who apparently had opinions about everything. Kaelvorn brought water from a nearby stream in a cupped leaf, badly, spilling half of it down his own sleeve, which Valira found so genuinely funny she had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing at a king. Something amusing? He asked, shaking water off his hand. Nothing, just admiring the Alpha King's superior leaf-carrying technique. It's harder than it looks. I'm sure it is. Truly a skill passed down through generations of royal bloodlines. He threw a very unkingly scowl at her, and Nightshade, still lying against Valira's legs, let out a sound that was suspiciously close to a laugh of her own. A low, huffing chuff that made both humans stare at her. Did she just... I think she did. Traitor, Kaelvorn muttered at the wolf without any real heat in it, and knelt down to stroke her ears, his big hands gentle in a way that surprised Valira more than she wanted to admit. Here was a man the whole kingdom seemed to fear, kneeling in the dirt, murmuring something too soft for her to hear against the wolf's fur, his whole face gone soft and unguarded for just a moment. She looked away, giving him that privacy, and found herself thinking about the coldness in the market that morning, about Safi's honeyed insult, about a lifetime of being looked at like she was something to be managed rather than someone to be known. This man clearly carried his own version of that weight, just dressed up in gold instead of rags. She's not just a symbol to you, Valira said quietly, before she could stop herself. Kaelvorn's hand stilled on Nightshade's fur. He didn't look up right away. She was there the night I lost my brother, he said after a moment, voice rough at the edges. Sat with me for 3 days straight, didn't eat, didn't leave my side. Everyone else in the keep had things to manage. A kingdom doesn't pause for grief. She just stayed. He finally met Valira's eyes. So no, she's not a symbol. She's the only one who never needed anything from me except for me to be there. The honesty of it landed somewhere unexpected in Valira's chest, somewhere she hadn't given anyone permission to touch in a very long time. She swallowed, oddly unsteady, and reached for the only tool she trusted to put the world back at a manageable distance. Well, she said, for a mighty king, you're surprisingly capable of having feelings. Careful, Majesty. Keep talking like that and I might start liking you. Gods forbid, he said. But there was warmth threaded all through the words now, and something in the way he looked at her. Steady, curious, a little stunned. like he was seeing a color he didn't have a name for, made her pulse do something complicated and unfamiliar. Nightshade, apparently done with both of their nonsense, heaved herself up with a low grunt, circled once, and resettled herself directly between them, her heavy head landing half on Valira's knee and half on Kael'vorn's, effectively chaining the two humans together by sheer wolf-sized gravity. "I think," Valira said, trying and failing to sound unaffected, "your wolf just made a decision about the two of us." "She does that," Kael'vorn admitted, looking down at Nightshade with something like exasperated affection. "She's never wrong." Outside the cave, a horn sounded in the distance. 3 short blasts, urgent, and Kael'vorn's whole body went rigid, the softness of a moment ago vanishing under something colder, more careful. "Guards," he said, standing quickly, his hand already reaching for something at his belt out of old habit. "They shouldn't be looking this far into the woods. Not unless—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Valira watched the king's face shift into the mask she imagined the rest of his kingdom saw every single day, and felt, with an unwelcome jolt, that whatever had just started between them in that quiet cave was about to be tested by something much bigger than either of them. The horn sounded twice more before Kael'vorn moved, and in that brief pause, Valira watched an entire war take place behind his eyes, king against man, duty against something newer, something that had only existed for the length of one strange morning. "Stay here," he said finally, already ducking toward the cave mouth. "Both of you, please." "Please," Valira repeated, raising an eyebrow. Did the Alpha King just say please to a lowborn woman? "Don't get used to it," he called back, and then he was gone, swallowed by the tree line, his broad shoulders cutting through the fog like he was daring the forest to slow him down. Nightshade lifted her head, ears swiveling toward the sound of distant voices, and let out a low, unhappy whine. "I know," Valira murmured, scratching behind the wolf's ear the way she'd seen Kael'vorn do. "I don't like it either." They didn't have to wait long. Voices grew louder, clipped, urgent, the particular tone of soldiers trying very hard not to sound panicked in front of each other. And then Kael'vorn reappeared at the cave mouth, and behind him, unmistakably, walked a man who made the hair on Valira's arms stand up before he'd said a single word. He was handsome in the way a drawn blade is handsome, all clean lines and cold purpose, with silver threaded through dark hair pulled back severely, and eyes the color of a winter sky right before snow. He wore the deep green sash of the King's Council, and he looked at the cave, at Nightshade, at Valira, with the unhurried thoroughness of a man cataloging everything he might use later. "Chancellor Osimir," Kael'vorn said, and something in his voice had gone flat, careful, the voice of a man choosing every word like it might be turned into a weapon against him. "This isn't a council matter. Everything involving the sacred line is a council matter, Your Majesty." Osimir's smile didn't reach his winter sky eyes. He inclined his head toward Nightshade with what might have passed to an untrained observer, as respect. The kingdom was in an uproar, half the guard convinced she'd been stolen. Imagine my relief to find her merely entertaining company. His gaze slid to Valira, and she felt it like a hand checking her pockets. "And you are?" "Tired of being looked at like livestock at auction," Valira said before she could stop herself. "But since you asked so charmingly, Valira, of the lowborn line of Dorith." A ripple of something crossed Osimir's face. Surprise, quickly smoothed over, replaced by an interest that made Valira's stomach drop in a way instinct alone couldn't explain. "Lowborn," he repeated softly, as if tasting the word for a hidden flavor. How curious that the sacred wolf would choose to den herself beside a lowborn woman, of all the souls in this kingdom. His eyes flicked to Kael'vorn. Curious indeed. "She's not denning herself beside anyone," Kael'vorn said too quickly, and Valira caught the way Osimir's mouth curved at that. the small, satisfied curve of a man who'd just been handed a very useful piece of information for free. "Of course, Your Majesty." Aasimir bowed, smooth as oiled hinges. "I only meant to say, the sacred line has always shown a particular sense for these things. Choosing companions, I mean. It would be foolish to ignore what she's telling us." Valira didn't like the way he said telling us. Like Nightshade's exhausted choice to hide in a quiet cave had somehow become public property. A message to be decoded by men in green sashes. Beside her, the wolf had gone very still, ears flat, a low growl vibrating in her chest that hadn't been there a moment before. "She doesn't like you," Valira observed, not bothering to keep the satisfaction out of her voice. "The sacred line rarely likes anyone at first," Aasimir said smoothly, unbothered, myself included. "Trust is earned slowly with creatures of her significance." He turned back to Kael'vorn. "The Council will want a report, Your Majesty. Her condition is advancing. We cannot have her wandering into forbidden woods whenever the mood strikes her, not with everything riding on a safe berth." "She isn't a ledger entry, Aasimir." "No," Aasimir agreed pleasantly. "She's the reason the harvests haven't failed in 11 years, the reason the border sickness never crossed into our lands, the reason your father died peacefully in his sleep instead of in a war. We couldn't have won without her blessing on our soldiers. Forgive me for treating something so vital with appropriate care." It was, Valira realized, a masterclass in saying something cruel while wearing the face of someone being reasonable. And the worst part was that none of it was technically a lie. She watched Kael'vorn's jaw tighten, watched him swallow down a response that would have cost him something in front of his own council. "I'll bring her back myself," he said instead. "Tonight, when she's ready?" Aasimir's eyes lingered on Valira one moment too long. "And the lowborn woman?" "Is none of the Council's concern." "Everything near the sacred line is the Council's concern, Your Majesty. You know this better than anyone." Aasimir's smile widened just slightly, just enough to feel like a door quietly closing somewhere. "But I'm sure it's nothing, a chance meeting. Forest air does strange things to a man's judgment sometimes." He bowed again, unhurried, and turned to go, pausing only to add, almost as an afterthought, "Do be careful which doors you leave open, Your Majesty. Some things, once let in, are terribly difficult to let back out." He walked away without waiting for a response, his guards falling into step behind him like shadows remembering their shape. And it was only once the sound of them had faded into the trees that Kael'vorn let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than his chest. "I don't like him," Valira said flatly. "Nobody likes him. That's rather the point of him." Kael'vorn scrubbed a hand over his face, and for a moment he looked less like a king and more like an exhausted man who hadn't slept properly in longer than he'd admit. "Aasimir has served 3 generations of my family. He's brilliant, efficient, and has never once, in all that time, said a single word he didn't calculate down to the syllable. And you keep him around because a kingdom needs someone willing to make the cold calculations a king can't afford to make himself." Kael'vorn sat down heavily beside Nightshade, who immediately pressed herself against him, as if she could feel the tension coiled in his shoulders and had decided, wolf fashion, to simply lean it out of him. "Doesn't mean I trust him with things that matter to me." Things that matter to me. Valira noticed the way his eyes flicked toward her when he said it. Quick, almost embarrassed, like the sentence had gotten away from him before he could stop it. "Careful, Majesty," she said, deliberately light, deliberately steering them both back from whatever cliff edge that sentence had wandered toward. "A man like that collects things people accidentally reveal. You'll want to be more boring around him. Try talking about taxes." That surprised a real laugh out of him. Short, rough, but genuine. And Nightshade's tail thumped once against the cave floor in what Valira was fairly sure was approval. "You're not wrong," he admitted. though I suspect it's a bit late for boring where you're concerned. I'll take that as a compliment. It wasn't entirely one. I'll take it anyway. He looked at her then, really looked, the winter chill of Aasemir's visit slowly draining out of his face, replaced by something warmer, something that made the cave feel smaller and considerably less cold than it had any right to be. But underneath the warmth, Valera could see the shadow the Chancellor had left behind, the knowledge, unspoken between them, that whatever door had cracked open between a low-born woman and a king that morning had already been noticed by exactly the sort of man who made a career out of prying doors the rest of the way off their hinges. He's going to make trouble, Valera said quietly. Yes, Kael'vorn agreed, without a trace of doubt. He usually does. Beside them, Nightshade let out a long, weary sigh, resting her enormous head between her paws, and Valera found herself wondering, not for the first time that day, and certainly not for the last, exactly how much a person could come to care about a king, a wolf, and a life she'd never asked for, in the span of one very strange morning in the woods. 3 days passed before Valera saw either of them again, and she spent every one of those days telling herself she didn't mind. She minded quite a lot, as it turned out. The forest felt different without the low rumble of a king's laughter or the warm, heavy weight of a wolf's head against her leg. She still walked her usual path each morning, past Safi's stall and its usual serving of honeyed insults, out toward the tree line where the world stopped judging her. But the quiet that used to feel like peace now felt uncomfortably close to loneliness, and that annoyed her more than she wanted to admit. "You're distracted," her grandmother said on the third evening, not looking up from the mending in her lap. Old Miren had raised Valera since she was 7 in the small crooked house at the very edge of Dorth's low-born quarter, and had exactly one skill more finely honed than her needlework, seeing straight through her granddaughter's nonsense. "I'm not distracted. You've resewn that same hem 4 times. It was fine after the first." Valera looked down at the sad little scrap of fabric in her hands and set it aside with as much dignity as she could muster. "Fine. I met someone in the woods." Miren's needle paused. "A someone, or a someone. Don't say it like that. I'll say it exactly like that until you tell me who has my granddaughter mending the same hem 4 times like a lovesick girl half her sense." Valera opened her mouth to argue and found humiliatingly that no argument arrived. "It's complicated," she said instead, which was as close to a confession as she was willing to make. "It always is, with the good ones." Miren went back to her stitching, entirely too pleased with herself. "Bring him for supper sometime. I'll pretend not to interrogate him." "You would absolutely interrogate him." "Within an inch of his life," Miren agreed cheerfully. "Someone has to, since you clearly won't." It was on the 4th morning that Nightshade found her, not the other way around for once. Valera had barely reached the tree line when a familiar black shape came trotting out from between the trunks, tail wagging with an enthusiasm entirely unbecoming of a creature the whole kingdom treated as sacred. "Well, look who remembered I exist," Valera said, crouching down as Nightshade nearly bowled her over, pressing her considerable bulk against her with a happy, huffing groan. "Careful. You've got precious cargo in there, remember." Nightshade responded by flopping down directly on top of her feet, effectively pinning her in place, which Valera decided to interpret as the wolf's version of stay. "She missed you," said a voice behind her, and Valera didn't need to turn around to know exactly whose it was. She felt it first, low in her stomach, an entirely inconvenient reaction to a voice she'd only heard 3 times in her life. Which is saying something. She usually reserves that particular enthusiasm for meat. "High praise," Valera said, standing and brushing the dirt from her knees, doing her absolute best to look unaffected by the sight of Kael'vorn leaning against a tree, arms crossed, looking considerably less kingly, and considerably more like a man who hadn't slept well in days. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You look terrible, by the way." "Thank you. I do try." "I'm serious. Osimir been keeping you up nights, discussing taxes? Something like that. He pushed off from the tree and fell into step beside her as she started walking, Nightshade trotting ahead of them both like she'd appointed herself chaperone. The council wants a formal announcement about the pregnancy, a ceremony, blessings from every corner of the kingdom, prayers said over her for weeks. Osimir's already drafting the guest list. And you don't want that? I want her to be able to nap in a quiet cave without a delegation showing up to bless her ears, Kael'vorn said, with enough weariness that Valira found herself laughing before she could help it. But apparently, let the wolf rest isn't a position with much political support. Shocking. I'd have thought stop bothering the exhausted pregnant creature would poll extremely well. You'd think. He glanced sideways at her, something warm working its way past the tiredness in his face. You're the only advisor I have who agrees with me, and you're not even on the council. I'm not on the council because I'm lowborn, Your Majesty, in case you'd forgotten the several dozen times the town's been eager to remind me. I hadn't forgotten. Something shifted in his voice. Quieter now, more careful. For what it's worth, I don't much care what line you come from. Valira glanced at him, surprised at how much she wanted to believe that, and how dangerous it felt to want something that badly. That's easy to say in a forest where nobody's watching. Maybe, he admitted. But I'd say it in the throne room too, if it came to that. She didn't have a clever answer for that one. For once, the sharp retort she usually kept loaded didn't come, and they walked in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable so much as full of something neither of them had a name for yet, something that made the air between them feel charged in a way the cool forest morning shouldn't have allowed. Nightshade, apparently sensing the shift, chose that exact moment to stop dead in the path, turn around, and stare at them both with the unmistakable expression of a creature who found her two humans utterly ridiculous. What? Kael'vorn asked her. Nightshade huffed, shook out her fur, and flopped down in the middle of the trail with a heavy, deliberate sigh, clearly announcing that she had no intention of moving another inch until the two of them sorted themselves out. I think, Valira said, biting back a laugh, your sacred wolf just staged a protest. She does this, Kael'vorn said, crouching down beside her and running a gentle hand along her side, checking on her the way he always did, careful and thorough despite the teasing. Usually when she thinks I'm being an idiot. An astute judge of character, then. Devastatingly so. He looked up at Valira, and there was something in his expression, open, a little helpless, entirely unguarded, that made her chest ache in an unfamiliar way. She liked you immediately, you know. That first day, she's never done that with anyone outside the keep. Maybe she has good taste. Maybe she does. His voice had gone soft, and for a moment neither of them moved, the forest holding its breath around them the way it had the very first day, like it too was waiting to see what would happen next. It was Nightshade who broke the moment, heaving herself back up with a long-suffering groan and nudging her large head between them both, effectively wedging herself into whatever charged silence had been building and huffing at them like she was extremely done with their nonsense. I think that's her way of saying not yet, Valira said, laughing despite herself, grateful for the interruption even as some small, reckless part of her wished it hadn't come. She's very protective, Kael'vorn agreed, scratching behind Nightshade's ear with obvious affection, of the kingdom, of her pups, and apparently now of my dignity as well. Someone has to be. Cruel. Accurate, Valira corrected, and he laughed, that same rough, rusty sound, like joy was a muscle he was only just beginning to remember how to use, and for a little while, walking together through the quiet trees with a very opinionated wolf wedged firmly between them, none of it felt complicated at all. It felt, for the first time in either of their lives, remarkably close to easy. But even as the morning stretched on, golden and unhurried, Valira couldn't quite shake the memory of Osimir's winter sky eyes, or his parting words about doors too difficult to close once opened. And some quiet, wary part of her kept listening for the sound of a horn in the distance, waiting for the next reminder that whatever was growing between them had already been seen, already been measured, and already, somewhere in a cold council chamber, was being turned into a problem to be solved. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a guard who looked deeply uncomfortable delivering royal correspondence to the lowborn quarter, and who practically threw the sealed parchment at Valira before hurrying away like the street itself might be contagious. "Well," Maren said, peering over her shoulder at the heavy wax seal, "that's either a marriage proposal or a death sentence. Should I start planning a funeral or a wedding?" "Neither, probably. Knock on wood." Valira broke the seal, unfolded the parchment, and read it twice before the words fully landed. "The presence of Valira of Dorith is requested at the autumn blessing ceremony, in honor of the sacred line and her forthcoming young, by personal invitation of His Majesty, King Caelvorn Drast Ren." "Oh no," Valira said, sitting down heavily. "Oh yes," said Mirana, already reaching for the good sewing kit, eyes gleaming with the particular delight of a grandmother who'd just been handed a project. "We have work to do." The keep, when Valira arrived 3 days later in a dress Miren had somehow conjured out of nothing but stubbornness and good thread, looked exactly like she'd always imagined it would from the outside, all soaring stone and colored glass, and exactly nothing like she'd expected on the inside. It was warmer than she'd pictured, less like a fortress, and more like a home that had simply gotten too big for itself, hung with autumn leaves and lanterns instead of the cold banners she'd half braced for. It didn't stop her stomach from twisting into knots the size of fists as she stepped through the great doors, painfully aware of every eye that swept over her plain dress, her calloused hands, her complete absence of anything resembling noble blood. "You came," Caelvorn said, appearing at her side with an expression of such genuine relief that some of her nerves loosened despite themselves. He looked almost unbearably handsome in ceremonial dark green, though the collar sat visibly crooked, like he'd fought with it and lost. "Your collar's a disaster," she said, instead of anything sensible. "I'm aware. I have people for that, and apparently none of them were fast enough this morning." He tugged at it hopelessly, making it worse. "Hold still." Valira reached up without thinking and straightened it herself, fingers brushing his jaw for one unbearably long second, and felt the entire room seem to hold its breath around them. Or maybe that was just her own lungs, forgetting their job entirely. There. Presentable. Barely. High praise from a woman who insulted my leaf-carrying technique. I stand by that assessment, too. Somewhere near the center of the hall, Nightshade let out a long, impatient bark, clearly displeased at being kept waiting for whatever ceremony this was meant to be, her enormous belly swaying gently as she paced. "I should go," Caelvorn said, though he made no move to actually leave. "The blessing starts soon." "Then go be kingly. I'll be over here, trying very hard not to trip on this dress." He laughed, that low, rusty sound she'd come to listen for, and reluctantly peeled himself away toward the dais, leaving Valira alone at the edge of a crowd that had absolutely noticed her and absolutely had opinions about it. "Lowborn," someone murmured nearby, not quite quiet enough. "At the autumn blessing. Whatever next?" Valira kept her chin up, the old familiar armor sliding back into place, and told herself she didn't care. She was still telling herself that when Chancellor Osamir appeared at her elbow like a shadow with excellent timing. "Valira of Dorith," he said pleasantly. "How lovely that you found something suitable to wear on such short notice." "Chancellor?" She didn't bother pretending warmth she didn't feel. "Still counting things that don't belong to you?" His smile sharpened, just slightly, appreciating the jab even as it landed. "I simply count consequences, my dear. It's rather my job." He glanced toward the dais, where Caelvorn stood beside Nightshade, both bathed in lantern light. He looks happier than I've seen him in years, you know. It's remarkable, really, what a person will risk for a feeling that pleasant. Is that a threat? It's an observation. Aasamir's winter eyes settled on her, unreadable. Though I'll offer you one piece of honest counsel, since you seem unlikely to take anyone's advice regardless. The council has already begun asking who you are, where you came from, what you might want. He paused. I'd be very careful what answer you let them find before you've decided it yourself. He bowed and melted back into the crowd before she could respond, leaving her with an uncomfortable chill despite the warm hall and the distinct unpleasant sensation of having just been warned by the one person in the room she trusted least. The ceremony itself was, despite everything, beautiful. Elders from every corner of the kingdom spoke blessings over Nightshade in old, rolling words Valira didn't fully understand, scattering dried herbs across her black fur while she lay patient and dignified atop a bed of woven leaves, clearly enjoying the attention despite her earlier impatience. Kaelvorn knelt beside her the entire time, one hand resting on her flank, his face open in a way Valira suspected very few people in that hall had ever been permitted to see. When it ended, and the crowd dispersed into smaller clusters of wine and gossip, Valira slipped away toward the gardens, needing air that didn't taste like other people's judgment. She found Kaelvorn there before her, sitting on a low stone wall beside a very sleepy Nightshade, staring up at the darkening sky with the particular exhaustion of a man who'd spent the whole evening performing a version of himself. Ceremonies are exhausting, she said, sitting beside him without waiting for an invitation. You have no idea. He rubbed his eyes. Aasamir cornered you, didn't he? I saw him drift over. He offered me advice I didn't ask for. That's practically his signature move. He's not wrong about one thing, though. Valira looked down at her hands. People are asking who I am, what I want, what I'm for, as if I'm a tool someone forgot to catalog. Kaelvorn was quiet a moment. And what do you want? The question landed harder than she expected, and for once she didn't have a sharp answer ready. I don't know, she admitted. Nobody's ever asked me that and actually waited for the answer before. I'm waiting. She looked at him, truly looked, at his tired eyes, the collar he'd never quite fixed, the deep kindness he carried beneath all that armor of duty, and felt something open in her chest, overwhelming and warm. I think, she said slowly, I want to matter to someone without having to earn it first. I've spent my whole life proving I deserve to take up space. I'm tired of proving things. You don't have to prove anything to me, Kaelvorn said quietly. You never have. Nightshade, sensing the shift in the air, lifted her head and let out a soft, encouraging whine, nudging her nose against Valira's hand, as though pushing her gently toward something. Your wolf is matchmaking again, Valira said, voice unsteady with something that wasn't quite laughter. She has excellent instincts. Kaelvorn's hand found hers on the cool stone, careful, waiting for her to pull away if she wanted to. She didn't. I know this is complicated. I know what the council will say, what the town will say, what 100 years of tradition will say. I don't care. You should care. It's your kingdom. It's my kingdom, he agreed. And I intend to spend the rest of my life making decisions for it. I'd like to start with an honest one. Valira's heart was hammering loud enough she was fairly certain the whole garden could hear it. And what decision is that? That I'd like to know you, he said simply. Properly. Not as the low-born woman who found my wolf in a cave. As Valira. Whoever that turns out to be once she stops expecting the worst from everyone around her. For a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. Then Valira laughed, soft, disbelieving, the sound catching somewhere between joy and fear, and leaned her head, just slightly against his shoulder. Careful, Majesty, she murmured. Keep saying things like that, and I might actually let you. Above them, the stars had come out in full over the garden, and beside them, Nightshade let out a long, satisfied sigh, curling herself into a contented black crescent at their feet. As if she, better than anyone, understood exactly what had just quietly, irreversibly begun. But far off, past the garden walls, a single lantern still burned in a high council window, where Chancellor Osimir sat alone with a fresh sheet of parchment, already writing the first lines of a report that would, before long, turn that quiet garden moment into something else entirely. The summons came at dawn, which Valira was quickly learning was never a good sign in this particular kingdom. She'd barely finished lacing her boots when Mirene's front door rattled under an urgent knock, and a palace page, younger than Valira, out of breath, clearly having run the entire way from the keep, announced that the Chancellor requested her presence immediately, on a matter of, quote, considerable delicacy. Considerable delicacy, Mirene repeated, unimpressed, from her chair by the fire. That man's never said anything delicate in his life. He probably invented the phrase specifically to make people nervous. It's working, Valira admitted. Take a scarf, and your spine. You'll need both. The council chamber was colder than the rest of the keep, all sharp stone and sharper portraits of ancestors who'd apparently never smiled in their lives. And Osimir sat at the head of a long table looking every bit as composed and unreadable as he had in the forest days before. Thank you for coming, he said, gesturing to the single empty chair across from him. Positioned, Valira noticed, so that the morning light fell directly on her face while leaving his in comfortable shadow. Petty theatrics. She sat anyway, refusing to give him the satisfaction of looking rattled. You said this was delicate. It is. I'll be direct, since I suspect bluntness is the only currency you respect. Osimir folded his hands. The kingdom is fond of stories, Valira. Fonder, sometimes, than it is of truth. And there's a story spreading rather quickly through the keep about a low-born woman who found the sacred wolf, and a king who's since lost his head over her. Is that a question? It's a concern. His winter eyes didn't blink. You should know that not everyone finds the story charming. There are elders who remember what happened the last time a king let his heart choose before his council did. Valira kept her face carefully still, though something cold slid down her spine. What happened? That's a conversation for another day, perhaps. Osimir's smile was thin. What matters today is this. The sacred line's blessing on this kingdom has held for 11 generations because the crown has always put the realm first, in matters both large and small. Marriage, alliance, duty. Every king before Kelvorn understood that his heart was a resource belonging to his people, not a private indulgence. And you think I'm an indulgence? I think, Osimir said, choosing each word like a man setting stones into a wall, that a king distracted by feeling is a king who makes mistakes. And mistakes, in a kingdom that depends on one very pregnant wolf for its prosperity, tend to be extremely expensive. Valira held his gaze, refusing to look away first. You've never once asked what I want in any of this. Something flickered behind Osimir's composure, brief, almost human. No, he admitted, quieter than before. I suppose I haven't. It rarely matters in questions of the crown what anyone individually wants. I learned that lesson a long time ago, at considerable cost. I'd hoped to spare His Majesty the same lesson. For just a moment, the mask slipped further, and Valira glimpsed something underneath it. Old grief, carefully buried under decades of cold efficiency. He's the only family I have left, Valira. Whatever you think of my methods, know that they come from wanting to protect him. I've simply learned that protection rarely looks kind from the outside. It was, Valira realized with some surprise, the most honest thing Osimir had said to her yet. And it didn't make her trust him anymore, but it did make her understand him considerably better. You could just talk to him, she said, instead of scheming around him like he's a puzzle to be managed. I've tried talking to him, He doesn't listen to reason when it comes wrapped in someone else's fear. Osamir stood, smoothing his sash. So I'm talking to you instead. Consider this your only warning delivered kindly. The council meets in a fortnight to discuss the succession and the terms of any entanglements the crown might pursue. I'd advise you to think very carefully about what you're prepared to survive. He left without waiting for a response, and Valera sat alone in the cold chamber for a long moment, her heart hammering somewhere between fury and fear. She found Kaelvorn in the training yard that afternoon, working through forms with a wooden practice sword against an equally patient guard. Sweat-soaked and clearly using the exercise to burn off something that had nothing to do with swordplay. Osamir summoned me this morning, she said, without preamble. Kaelvorn's blade stopped mid-swing. He did what? Sit down before you set something on fire with that expression. She waited until he'd handed off the practice sword and dropped onto the low wall beside her, jaw tight. He didn't threaten me, exactly. He just reminded me that kings have obligations, and that hearts are apparently kingdom property. That's absurd. Is it, though? Valera looked at him carefully. Because he mentioned something happened once before. A king who let his heart choose before the council did. He didn't finish the story. Something shuddered behind Kaelvorn's eyes, quick and painful. My father, he said finally, voice low. He loved a woman the council disapproved of. They separated them, for the good of the kingdom's alliances. She left the territory entirely. He married my mother a year later, out of duty, and never once looked at her the way I imagine he'd looked at the woman he lost. He was quiet a moment. I grew up watching two people be perfectly civil to each other for 30 years. I always swore I wouldn't live that particular kind of loneliness. And Osamir was there for all of it. Osamir was the one who delivered the message separating them, Kaelvorn said quietly. He was young then, new to the council, and it was his first real assignment. I don't think he's ever forgiven himself for how well he did his job that day. I think that's exactly why he's so determined to save me from the same story, even if his methods are admittedly monstrous. Valera absorbed that, feeling her anger soften into something more complicated. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding, at least, of the shape of the man she was up against. He's not entirely wrong to worry, she said slowly. I'm nobody, Kaelvorn, lowborn, no alliance, no dowry, no army behind my name. If the council decides I'm a liability, then the council can decide whatever it likes, Kaelvorn said, with a sudden fierce steadiness that startled her. I watched my father choose duty over the person he loved, and I watched it hollow him out for the rest of his life. I won't repeat his mistake just because it's tidier for everyone else. Nearby, Nightshade, who had been dozing in a patch of sun through the entire conversation with the supreme indifference of a creature who'd earned her rest, chose that exact moment to sit bolt upright, ears pricked, and let out a single sharp bark directly at both of them, as though personally offended at being ignored during matters this important. I think she agrees with me, Kaelvorn said. Or she's hungry. With her, it's frequently both. Despite everything, Valera laughed, a real laugh, one that loosened the knot Osamir's chamber had tied in her chest. And Kaelvorn reached over, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear with a tenderness that made the whole training yard feel briefly, impossibly quiet around them. I'm not asking you to fight a council for me, she said softly. I'd understand if it was easier not to. I know, he said. That's precisely why I intend to. Nightshade let out a long, satisfied huff, flopping back down into her sunny patch as if the matter were settled entirely to her liking. And for a moment, standing there in the golden afternoon light with a stubborn king and an opinionated wolf, Valera let herself believe, just a little, that maybe this particular story didn't have to end the way his father's had. She didn't yet know how wrong that fragile hope was about to be tested. 2 weeks of stolen mornings had done something Valera hadn't expected. They'd made her happy, plainly and uncomplicatedly happy, in a way that felt almost dangerous after a lifetime of bracing for the other shoe. Which was, of course, exactly when the other shoe arrived. It came in the form of Miren's front door bursting open before dawn. Not with a polite knock this time, but with the flat of a palm, and a wide-eyed neighbor boy gasping out words that took Valira a full 3 seconds to untangle. The sacred wolf. She's gone missing from the keep. And they're saying someone took her, and half the guards already searching the lowborn quarter first, and... Valira was out the door before he finished the sentence. Miren's voice chasing her down the street with something that sounded suspiciously like a prayer. The keep was chaos by the time she arrived, guards fanned out across the grounds, torches still burning uselessly in the gray dawn light, and Kaelvorn standing in the middle of it all with the particular stillness of a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. Kaelvorn, she's not in her den, not in the gardens, not anywhere on the grounds. His voice was tight, controlled in a way that scared her more than shouting would have. Someone took her, Valira. In her condition, someone took her. Who would? I don't know. He raked a hand through his hair, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw real fear crack through the composure he wore like armor. She's due any week now. If something happens to her out there, alone, frightened, we'll find her. Valira caught his arm, grounding him with the contact. She's smart, and she's strong, and she survived worse than one bad morning. It was Aasimir who found them, moving through the chaos with unnerving calm, a scrap of dark fabric held between 2 fingers like something distasteful. This was found snagged on the fence near the eastern gate, he said, holding it out. Valira's stomach dropped before her mind had even finished the thought. The fabric was rough-spun, patched, unmistakably low-born cloth, the exact weave used in half the houses in her own quarter. The guards nearest them went very quiet in a way that had weight to it. That doesn't mean anything, Valira said, too fast, feeling the ground shift under her feet. Half the low-born quarter wears cloth exactly like that. It's the only fabric we can afford. I'm aware, Aasimir said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. I'm simply reporting what was found and where. I make no accusations. But his eyes, cold and assessing, lingered on her a moment too long, and around them she could feel the whispers beginning to gather like storm clouds. Low-born woman, low-born cloth, convenient timing. Wonder if she planned this all along to get closer to the crown. You think I did this, Valira said, low and furious, rounding on Aasimir. You think I'd hurt her? I think, Aasimir said carefully, that the council will ask the question whether I do or not, and I would rather you hear it from me, plainly, than from a mob that's already decided the answer. For just a moment, something almost sympathetic crossed his face. For what it's worth, I don't believe you did this. I've watched how she looks at you. Wolves that size don't fake affection for someone dangerous to her pups. He paused. But belief isn't evidence, and fear makes poor judges of everyone in this courtyard right now, myself included. It was, infuriatingly, the kindest thing he'd ever said to her, wrapped inside the coldest possible context. Then help me prove it, Valira said. Help me find her before this becomes about anything other than getting her home safely. Something shifted behind Aasimir's winter eyes. Calculation? Yes, always calculation. But under it, for just a heartbeat, something that looked almost like respect. Very well, he said, and turned to bark orders at the nearest guards with the crisp efficiency of a man who, whatever else he was, clearly knew how to organize a search. They found her by mid-morning, in a hollow half a mile past the eastern boundary, not stolen, as it turned out, but frightened into flight by a genuine threat. A pack of wild dogs, desperate from the early frost, had surrounded her near the old mill. She escaped with scratches along her side, tired and shaken, but alive, and Valira's heart nearly stopped counting. The pups inside her were still, blessedly, safe. Kaelvorn was on his knees beside her before the guards had even finished calling the all clear, hands running gently over her fur, checking every scratch with a tenderness that made Valira's throat tighten. "You scared the life out of me," he murmured against Nightshade's ear, voice cracking on the words. "Don't you dare do that again!" Nightshade, exhausted as she was, managed a weak thump of her tail against the ground and pressed her head into his chest, and for a long moment neither of them moved, man and wolf breathing together in the cold morning air. It was only once the healers had checked her over, only once she'd been settled onto a cart lined with warm blankets for the slow journey home, that Kaelvorn finally turned back to Valira. And she watched, with dawning horror, something new settle into his face. Not anger at her, worse, fear for her. "The torn fabric," he said quietly. "It's not what it looks like. I know that. I know you'd never—" He stopped, jaw working. But half the council doesn't know that, and now they have a story that fits together too neatly for anyone frightened enough to want a simple answer. A low-born woman, suddenly close to the crown, present the day the sacred line goes missing. His eyes were pained. "I need you to understand what's coming. It won't be fair. It won't be kind." "I don't care about fair," Valira said, though her voice shook more than she wanted it to. "I care about you not looking at me like you're already saying goodbye." "I'm not saying goodbye." His hand found hers, gripping tight. "I'm saying I need you to be ready to fight. Because I intend to, and I don't yet know what it's going to cost either of us." Behind them, from her cart, Nightshade let out a low, exhausted whine, ears pinned, eyes darting between the two of them with an unmistakable distress that had nothing to do with her scratches. "She's worried," Valira said softly, moving to rest a hand against the wolf's side. "About us." "She's always been better at reading people than the entire council combined," Kaelvorn said, with a broken half-laugh that held no real humor in it. "Maybe we should let her run the kingdom instead." "I'd vote for her." "So would half the guard, honestly." He managed a ghost of his usual warmth, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "She'd start every council meeting by falling asleep in the middle of it, which is frankly an improvement on most of our current members." Nightshade huffed, unimpressed by being discussed like she wasn't lying right there, and nudged her nose hard into Valira's palm as though trying, in her own exhausted way, to hold the two humans together through sheer stubborn wolf will. But even as Valira managed a small, watery laugh, she could feel it, the shift in the air around them, the whispers already spreading through the returning guards, the story hardening into shape whether it was true or not. Somewhere back at the keep, a council was gathering, and a chancellor with cold eyes and an old, unhealed grief was already deciding exactly how much protection he was willing to offer a king determined to make his father's mistake all over again. Or perhaps, this time, to finally break the pattern for good. Whatever was coming, Valira understood. Standing in that frost-bitten field with her hand resting against an exhausted sacred wolf, it would arrive very soon, and it would demand, from both of them, far more than either was entirely prepared to give. The council chamber was full for the first time since Valira had set foot in the keep, every seat occupied, every eye trained on her the moment she walked through the doors at Kaelvorn's side, and she understood, immediately and completely, that whatever this was, it had stopped being a private matter days ago. "Thank you all for gathering," Aasimir said, standing at the head of the long table, his voice carrying easily across the crowded room. "We're here to address a matter of some delicacy. The events surrounding the disappearance of the sacred line and the question of the crowns. Personal entanglements." "This isn't a trial," Kaelvorn said sharply, his hand tightening briefly around Valira's before releasing her to stand on her own. A small gesture, but she understood exactly why he'd made it. "Whatever happened here, She needed to be seen standing on her own feet. "No," Asimir agreed smoothly. "It's a council meeting. Though I confess the two have begun to resemble each other rather more than I'd like." He turned to address the room. "Elders, ministers, you all know the facts as reported. The sacred line went missing the same week a low-born woman became a fixture at the king's side. She was recovered safely, thank the old gods, injured by feral dogs rather than any deliberate harm. But the timing has raised questions I'm obligated to bring before this council, whether I personally credit them or not." A murmur rippled through the room, and Valira felt every one of those stares like small stones. "I did not harm her," she said, loud enough to cut through the murmuring, refusing to let her voice shake. "I found her, frightened and alone, protecting something she hadn't even had yet. I sat with her. I never once wished her anything but well. And yet," said an elder near the back, an ancient woman with sharp eyes and sharper judgment, "you appeared from nowhere, low-born and unconnected, precisely when the crown's attention began to wander from its duties. Convenient timing, wouldn't you agree?" "Convenient for whom?" Valira shot back. "I gained nothing from this. I lost my quiet mornings, my privacy, and apparently my good name. Also, I could be accused of endangering a creature I've come to care for as much as anyone in this room ever has." "She speaks true," Kaelvorn said, stepping forward. "I've watched Valira with Nightshade for weeks now. There's no version of this story where she's the villain. If anything—" His jaw tightened. The true failure here belongs to a council so consumed with appearances that they'd rather find someone convenient to blame than admit a pack of starving dogs frightened her into flight. "Careful, Your Majesty," Asimir said quietly, though something in his tone had shifted. Less needling now, more genuinely weary. "You're not doing her any favors, defending her so fiercely in front of people already inclined to believe your judgment is compromised. My judgment has never been clearer. That's precisely what worries me." Asimir's winter eyes moved between them, and for a long moment the chamber held its breath, waiting on whatever verdict the Chancellor was building toward. "Elders, I've spent 30 years serving this crown by keeping its heart separate from its duty. I believed, for a long time, that separation was the only thing standing between this kingdom's prosperity and ruin." He paused, and something old and tired crossed his face. "I was wrong once before, about a king and a woman he loved, and I've carried the cost of that wrongness for 3 decades. The room went utterly silent. Even Kaelvorn looked startled. "I watched a young king fold in on himself for 30 years because I did my job too well," Asimir continued, quieter now, almost to himself. "I have spent every day since telling myself it was necessary, that the kingdom needed a king unclouded by feeling. But I find myself standing here watching his son fight this hard for someone, and I find I no longer have the stomach to make the same argument twice." He looked directly at Valira. "You are lowborn. You have no army, no alliance, no dowry to offer this kingdom. By every traditional measure, you are precisely the sort of match this council exists to prevent." Valira's heart sank, bracing for the blow she'd known was coming since the moment she walked in. "And yet," Asimir said, "I watched that wolf choose you, out of every soul in this kingdom, the very first day you met her. I've never known the sacred line to be wrong about a single soul in 11 generations of service to this family. She trusted you before any of us did. Perhaps it's time the rest of us learn to trust her judgment too." A stunned silence followed, broken only by a soft, satisfied huff from the doorway, where Nightshade, still healing but stubbornly mobile, had apparently dragged herself in to observe the proceedings, and now sat looking extremely pleased with herself, tail thumping once against the stone floor as if to say, finally. "Chancellor?" Kaelvorn started, visibly thrown. "Don't misunderstand me, Your Majesty," Asimir said briskly, composure sliding back into place like a mask returning to its rightful position. "I still think this is reckless, poorly timed, and likely to cause considerable political inconvenience for at least the next several years. I simply find I'm no longer willing to be the man who tells another Wren King to bury what he feels for the sake of tidiness. I did that once. I won't do it again. He glanced toward the ancient elder who'd spoken earlier. The council may vote as it wishes on the matter of the crown's personal choices. I formally withdraw my objection. The room erupted into a dozen overlapping conversations at once, elders muttering to each other, ministers exchanging startled glances, and in the middle of it all, Valira found herself laughing. A slightly hysterical, disbelieving laugh, equal parts relief and shock. "Did the Chancellor just defend me?" she whispered to Caelvorn. "I believe he did," Caelvorn murmured back, looking equally stunned. "I may need to check him for fever." "I heard that," Aasimir said dryly, without turning around, already moving to quiet the arguing elders with the same brisk efficiency he brought to everything. "And for the record, Your Majesty, I still expect regular reports on the succession planning. I haven't gone soft. I've simply recalculated the numbers." "Of course you have. Someone has to keep this family's math honest." But there was something almost like warmth in the Chancellor's clipped tone now, a crack of humanity showing through decades of careful armor. And Valira thought, not for the first time, but for the first time without bitterness, that perhaps Aasimir wasn't quite the villain she'd first taken him for. Just a man who'd learned the wrong lesson from an old grief, and was only now, slowly, learning to unlearn it. The council vote, when it finally came after another hour of heated debate, was closer than Valira would have liked. But it came down, in the end, in their favor, the ancient elder herself casting the deciding voice with a long, considering look at Nightshade, who had fallen fast asleep in the middle of the chamber floor sometime during the argument, entirely unbothered by the weight of the decision being made around her. "Well," Caelvorn said, once the chamber had finally emptied, and it was just the three of them left in the quiet. Man, woman, and one deeply unbothered sleeping wolf. "That went considerably better than I expected. Your sacred wolf slept through the entire thing. She has excellent instincts," he said, echoing his own words from weeks before, and pulling Valira into him with a relief so complete it seemed to shake something loose in his chest. She knew it would be fine. Or she was just tired from being chased by dogs. Also possible, he admitted, laughing against her hair. "Let's give her credit for both." Nightshade, as if personally offended at being discussed while unconscious, cracked one golden eye open, huffed pointedly at them both, and went straight back to sleep, leaving the two of them standing together in the emptying council chamber, holding on to each other and the fragile, hard-won beginning of something that, for the first time since it started, finally felt like it might actually survive. Nightshade had been pacing her den since before sunrise, and by mid-morning, Valira had learned an important new fact about herself. She was apparently entirely useless in a crisis involving imminent puppies. "She keeps circling," Valira said, hovering uselessly at the edge of the den Caelvorn had built specially in the eastern garden. Warm, private, lined with soft moss and every blanket the keep apparently owned. "Is circling normal? Should I be worried about the circling?" "The circling is normal," said old Fenwick, the keep's wolf healer, without looking up from where she knelt beside Nightshade, her weathered hands moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd done this a dozen times before. "What would worry me is you fainting on top of her, which seems increasingly likely given your color." "I'm not going to faint." "You've gone the shade of curdled milk, dear." "That's just my natural complexion." Caelvorn, crouched on Nightshade's other side with one hand resting gently against her flank, glanced up with the ghost of a smile despite the tension pulling at his jaw. "For what it's worth, I fainted the first time. Completely. Gracelessly, face first into a bucket." "You did not." "I absolutely did. My father never let me forget it. Apparently kings are meant to remain composed during momentous kingdom events. and I remained composed for exactly 4 seconds before the bucket incident." Valira laughed despite herself, some of the knot in her chest loosening. "I feel much better about my own uselessness now." That was rather the point. Nightshade let out a low, focused sound. Not quite a whine, not quite a growl, something entirely her own. And both of them fell silent immediately, watching her with matching expressions of helpless devotion. "She's close," Fenwick said quietly. "This part, she doesn't need an audience for. She needs quiet, and she needs the two of you nearby, not hovering. Sit back. Let her work." They sat back. What followed, Valira would later think, was less a single dramatic event and more a long, quiet stretch of afternoons spent doing exactly nothing useful while something enormous and ancient happened just a few feet away, mostly hidden beneath moss and blankets in Fenwick's calm, competent hands. There was no need to watch closely. Fenwick made sure of that, positioning herself with quiet efficiency so that the process stayed private, Nightshade's dignity intact, even in her most vulnerable hour. Mostly, Valira and Kaelvorn sat side by side against the garden wall, holding hands so tightly her knuckles ached, trading nervous, useless conversation to keep from staring too hard at something that wasn't theirs to stare at. "Tell me something ridiculous," Valira said. "Anything. I need my brain to stop counting sounds." "Asimir once fell into the fountain during a diplomatic visit from the Northern Territories." "You're lying." "I am 100% not lying. Full ceremonial robes, entire fountain, in front of an ambassador he'd spent 6 months trying to impress. He has never once acknowledged that it happened. If you mention it, he simply looks at you like you've said something in a foreign language. I'm bringing it up at the next council meeting. I would pay every coin in the treasury to watch that." Somewhere behind them, Fenwick made a soft, satisfied sound, and Nightshade let out a long, low huff that carried something entirely new in it. Not distress, not exhaustion, but a kind of deep, settled relief. "That's one," Fenwick called back, not turning around. "Strong lungs on this one already. Give it time." Valira felt something crack open in her chest, warm and sudden, and beside her Kaelvorn had gone very still, his hand tightening around hers hard enough to hurt. "One," he repeated, voice cracking slightly on the word. "One," she agreed, and neither of them said anything else for a while, just sat there together, listening to the quiet, ordinary miracle happening a few feet away, blanket by blanket, breath by breath. By the time the sun had slid low enough to paint the garden gold, Fenwick finally sat back on her heels, wiped her hands on a cloth, and allowed herself the first real smile of the day. 4, she announced. All healthy, all breathing well, all already trying to out-argue each other over who gets the best spot to nurse. Very opinionated litter, this one. I suspect they take after their mother. 4, Kaelvorn breathed, like the number itself was something sacred. You may come closer now, Fenwick added, stepping back to let them approach. Slowly, quietly. She's earned her rest, and they've earned a gentle welcome, not a stampede. Valira approached the den on unsteady legs, Kaelvorn's hand still wrapped around hers, and found Nightshade curled protectively around 4 impossibly small shapes, 3 black as their mother's coat, one a soft, unexpected silver gray, all of them blind and squirming and utterly, entirely helpless in a way that made something ancient and tender rise up in Valira's chest. Nightshade looked up at them both, exhausted beyond words, and let out a soft, welcoming huff, nudging her nose gently against Valira's hand as if to say simply, "Look what I made." "Hello," Valira whispered, voice thick, kneeling carefully at the edge of the den. "Hello, you very small, very loud disasters. They're going to run this kingdom into the ground within a decade," Kaelvorn said, kneeling beside her, his voice equally unsteady. "I can already tell. Good. It could use some shaking up." They stayed like that for a long time, quiet and reverent, watching 4 small lives figure out how to exist in the world for the first time, until a familiar, clipped voice interrupted the moment from the garden path. "I was told there was news worth interrupting a council session for," Osamir said, arriving with his usual brisk efficiency, though he stopped short at the edge of the den, and something in his carefully composed face genuinely, visibly softened at the sight before him. "4," he said, quieter than Valira had ever heard him speak. 11 generations, and I've never once seen the birth myself, always occupied with some ledger or another." "You're welcome to stay for this one," Kaelvorn said. "Ledgers can wait." Osamir hesitated, an actual hesitation, rare and human, and then, to Valira's genuine surprise, knelt at the edge of the den himself, a careful, respectful distance away, watching the small silver-gray pup squirm its way toward its mother's warmth. "My grandmother served this line before me," he said quietly, almost to himself. "She used to say the sacred line chooses its moments to remind everyone what actually matters, right when the kingdom's gotten too busy counting coins to remember." He looked up, and something old and tired in his face had, for just a moment, gone entirely still and clear. "I think I forgot that lesson somewhere along the way, perhaps longer ago than I'd like to admit." "It's never too late to remember it," Valira said softly. Osamir studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his winter eyes, and then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth twitched upward, the closest thing to a genuine smile she'd ever seen cross his face. "No," he agreed. "Perhaps it isn't." He stood, brushing off his robes with characteristic briskness, though his eyes lingered a moment longer on the small silver-gray pup before he turned to go. "I'll leave the 2 of you to your celebrating. Someone still has to keep the ledgers honest, even on a day like this." He paused at the garden gate, glancing back once. "Congratulations, Your Majesty. And Valira, for what it's worth, I imagine the sacred line chose rather better than any of us gave her credit for. Twice, apparently." He left them there in the gold evening light, kneeling together beside an exhausted, radiant mother and 4 new, impossibly small lives, and Valira found herself laughing, soft, disbelieving, entirely overwhelmed, as Kaelvorn pulled her against his side. 4 pups, he murmured into her hair. "An entire kingdom's future, wrapped in blankets in my garden." "And a chancellor who almost smiled," Valira added. "I think that might be the bigger miracle, honestly." Nightshade let out a long, contented sigh, curling herself tighter around her small, sleeping family. And for the first time since Valira had walked out of that cave weeks ago, the whole garden felt entirely, perfectly still, full of nothing but warmth and beginnings, and the quiet certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. Spring had settled fully over the kingdom by the time the 4 pups outgrew their garden den, tumbling out across the palace grounds with the specific chaos of creatures who had recently discovered they had legs and intended to use them at all hours, in all directions, at maximum volume. "Ember, get out of the fountain," Valira called, for what felt like the 40th time that morning, watching the silver-gray pup shake water gleefully across 2 passing guards, who bore it with the weary good humor of men who'd long since accepted their fate. "I mean it. Out." Ember did not get out of the fountain. "She's your daughter," Kaelvorn said, appearing at Valira's side with the particular fondness of a man who found the chaos more delightful than exhausting. "She is not remotely my daughter. She has your exact expression right now. The one that says I have made a decision and no amount of reasoning will change it. I don't make that expression. You're making it right now, arguing with me about it." Valira opened her mouth to argue further, realized the argument would rather prove his point, and settled instead for shoving him lightly with her shoulder, which he took with entirely too much satisfaction. Nightshade, sprawled in a patch of sun nearby with the boneless contentment of a mother who had recently reclaimed several hours of uninterrupted sleep, lifted her head just long enough to watch her fountain-soaked pup with an expression of profound, long-suffering patience before letting it drop back down with a sigh that needed no translation. The council chamber, when they gathered there that afternoon, felt entirely different from the cold, judgment-laden room Valera remembered from months before. Sunlight fell warm through the high windows, and even the ancient elder who'd once questioned her so sharply now offered a small, approving nod as she took her seat, not beside the room's edge this time, but at the table itself, in a chair that had, over the winter, quietly become hers. "Before we begin," Asamir said, standing at the head of the table with a small scroll in hand, "there's a matter of formal record I'd like to address." He glanced at Kylvorn, something almost warm passing between them. "Your Majesty has asked that the Council formally recognize Valera of Dorith, no longer merely as a guest of the Crown, but as a permanent voice within it, advisor, and, pending certain private arrangements the two of you are no doubt eager to discuss without an audience, considerably more than that." A murmur ran through the room, though gentler now, curious rather than hostile. "I move to approve the appointment," said the ancient elder, before anyone else could speak. "The sacred line has never chosen poorly in 11 generations. I see no reason to doubt her 12th decision, especially given how thoroughly this one appears to have already rearranged the fountain, the gardens, and half my grandchildren's affections." Laughter rippled through the chamber, and Valera felt her throat tighten with something too large for the room to hold. "I second the motion," Asamir said, "though I'll note, for the official record, that I expect the appointment to come with reasonable expectations regarding punctuality, ledger comprehension, and an end to referring to council meetings as considerably worse than being chased by feral dogs." "I stand by that comparison," Valera said, and Asamir's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a real laugh she'd ever coaxed out of him. The vote passed unanimously. That evening, once the council had emptied, and the pups had finally, mercifully, worn themselves into an exhausted heap in Nightshade's den, Kylvorn found Valera alone in the garden, sitting on the low stone wall where they'd first admitted, months ago, exactly how much they'd come to matter to each other. "You're quiet," he said, sitting beside her. "I keep thinking about the woman who used to walk this forest alone, convinced nobody would ever look at her without seeing her family name first." Valera looked out over the darkening garden, the lanterns flickering to life one by one along the paths. "I don't know how to be that person anymore. I'm not sure I want to remember how." "Then don't," Kylvorn said simply. "You don't owe your old wounds anything, Valera. Not loyalty, not remembrance, not one more ounce of proving yourself to people who never deserve the effort." She turned to look at him. This man who'd once seemed carved entirely from thunder and duty, now soft-eyed and unguarded in the lantern light, utterly unrecognizable from the shouting stranger who'd once ducked through a cave mouth demanding to know what she'd done with his wolf. "I love you," she said simply, because after everything, there didn't seem to be any reason left to guard the words. "I don't think I've said that plainly yet." "You haven't," he agreed, voice rough. "I was beginning to wonder if you ever would, or if I'd have to steal the words from that grandmother of yours, since I suspect she'd hand them over gladly just to see the look on your face." "She absolutely would." "I love you too," he said. "I have, I think, since somewhere around the moment you told me my leaf-carrying technique was an embarrassment to royal bloodlines." "It was an embarrassment." "It was," he admitted, laughing, and kissed her. Slow, certain. The kind of kiss that carried an entire season of stolen mornings inside it. While behind them, unnoticed until it was too late, 4 small shapes had crept out of the den and were now watching their parents with identical expressions of profound canine judgment. Nightshade, arriving a moment later to herd her wayward pups back to bed, took one look at the scene, let out a long-suffering huff, and flopped down directly at their feet anyway, as if she'd long ago decided this particular nonsense was simply part of the family now, and there was no use fighting it. "I think," Valera said, laughing against Kylvorn's shoulder, Your sacred wolf just gave us her blessing. Again. She's very thorough that way. Above them, the stars had come out in full, and below, 4 small pups had already abandoned all pretense of bedtime, tumbling instead into a heap against their mother's side, and Valira thought, with a certainty that settled deep and warm in her chest, that whatever she'd once believed about her own worth, however small, however unworthy the world had once insisted she was, she had found in this garden, with this man and this wolf and this small, impossible family, exactly the kind of belonging she'd once given up hoping for. She had stopped proving herself to anyone. She had simply, finally, arrived. Epilogue. A year later, Valira stood at the edge of the same forest path she'd walked 1,000 times before, watching a young low-born girl hesitate at the tree line, thin-shouldered, chin trembling, clearly bracing for the whole world to tell her she didn't belong. "It's all right," Valira said gently, crouching down to meet her eyes. "This forest doesn't care what name you carry. Neither does the woman standing in it." Behind her, 4 grown, gangly pups came crashing through the underbrush in a tangle of paws and mischief, followed by Nightshade at an unhurried, dignified pace, and Kalevorn not far behind, laughing at something one of the pups had clearly just ruined. The girl's eyes went wide at the sight of the Sacred Line's family, and wider still when Ember, the silver-gray troublemaker of the litter, trotted straight up and pressed her nose affectionately into the girl's palm, tail wagging. "She likes you," Valira said softly. "She's never wrong about people. Neither was her mother once upon a time, in a cave not far from here." The girl looked up, something loosening in her small, worried face, and for the first time, smiled. Valira took her hand, and together they walked back toward the keep, toward warmth and lantern light, and a family that had taught her, finally, what it meant to be chosen